Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri Baradari Gopi Jana Giri Baradari Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri So we continue. Srila Prabhupada's Lilamrita, the pastimes of Srila Prabhupada. So, we last read about the very first initiation ceremony held in ISKCON was in New York, 26 2nd Avenue. And it also happened to be Prabhupada's Vyas Puja Day. It was on the day after Janmashtami. And Prabhupada appeared, took birth in this world on the day after Janmashtami, which is also known as Nandotsava. So it was a nice, auspicious beginning of Prabhupada to accept his first Western disciples. So now, we continue. About 30 people attended. The decorations were similar to the ones done for the initiation, which was just a few days before. So this is right after the initiation. Except the decorations were more festive and the feast was more lavish. Swamiji's, as Prabhupada is being called, Swamiji's front room was decorated with pine boughs. Boughs or boughs? What is that? Pine boughs. It's either the pine nuts or just the leaves from pine trees. And there were also flowers strung overhead, going from one side of the room to the other. Some of the new initiates came. They were carrying their new red large beads around their necks. We read that Prabhupada didn't bring any beads from India. So to give out beads, the devotees went to a bead shop in the Lower East Side, and they bought these big round red beads. They're like this. And they had to string them themselves. Prabhupada told them how to string it. And at the initiation ceremony, Prabhupada chanted, there was 11 people getting initiated, and Prabhupada chanted on each person's bead, right there, sitting down, which was something special. You know? They just sat there and watched and listened to Prabhupada chanting japa. And when you finish one round, one set of beads, you call the person, tell them their name, give them the beads. Then you take another set of beads, chant another round. This was the ceremony. It was quite unique. It said, these devotees who had gotten initiated had taken vows to chant 16 rounds a day, and they chanted them on their beads, just as the Swami had shown them. And they happily, those somewhat self-conscious, called out one another by their new names, by their new spiritual names. It was a new thing, so they were real excited to say those names, you know. Janaki, she was one of the first initiates. She said, Swamiji said that I should wear a sari at my wedding. I think the wedding, they're talking about the ceremony of the wedding, because it was right after the initiation. So she said, the Swamiji told me I should wear a sari at my wedding, and he said it should be made of silk. I asked him what color, and he said red. So Mukunda went and bought me an absolutely elegant sari and some very nice jewelry. So yeah, this is the wedding. The Swami's friends were all used to seeing Janaki as she normally came along with Mukunda. And usually she wore no makeup and was just dressed in plain clothes. So her friends were astounded to see her. They were somewhat embarrassed to see her wearing jewelry, makeup, and a bright red sari. The bride's hair was done up, braided and decorated with oval silver filigree hair ornaments. She wore heavy silver earrings, which Mukunda had purchased from an expensive Indian import shop on 5th Avenue, and he also got her some silver bracelets. Prabhupada directed Mukunda and Janaki to sit opposite him, facing him, on either side of the sacrificial arena. And just as at the initiation, he lit the incense and instructed them in the purification process by water and recited the mantra. And then he began to speak. Prabhupada explained about the relationship between man and wife in Krishna consciousness and how they should serve each other, how they should also serve Krishna. Prabhupada then asked Janaki's sister, who later became Jamuna, and she came for the wedding. That was the only family relative that came for the wedding. And they came from the west coast to the east coast. She came. And the very first day, Prabhupada engaged her in helping him make kachoris for the wedding. So, Prabhupada then asked Janaki's sister, whose name at the time I believe was Joan, to give her away, or to present her formally to Mukunda as his wife. Mukunda then repeated after the Swami that I accept Janaki as my wife and I shall take charge of her throughout both of our lives. We shall live together peacefully in Krishna consciousness and there will never be any separation. Then Prabhupada turned to Janaki and said, will you accept Sriman Mukunda Das Brahmachari as your life's companion? Will you serve him always and help him to execute his Krishna conscious activities? And Janaki replied, yes, I accept Mukunda as my husband for throughout my life. There shall never be any separation between us, either in happiness or distress. I shall serve him always, and we shall live together peacefully in Krishna consciousness. Now, no one knew anything of what was going on except the Swamiji. They were all young people, and this was at first. Swamiji led the chanting. He gave the lines for the bride and groom to exchange. He told them where to sit, what to do. In fact, he told them to get married. He was the one who told them to get married. Because before, they were boyfriend and girlfriend living together. And as soon as he got initiated, Prabhupada said, you know what this means, right? And Kunda said, no. He said, it means now you have to get married. You can't go and live in like as it were before. So, Prabhupada also had cooked an elaborate feast that was waiting in the kitchen after the completion of the ceremony. Prabhupada then asked Mukunda and Janaki to exchange their flower garlands. This type of marriage ceremony is called exchanging the garlands.
Gandharva.
Gandharva.
But it's like non-formal thing. But this was formal, so this was.
Yeah, they were doing it in front of the fire. So it was a little more than just. Normally, the devotees would do it in front of the deity. But the idea was They exchanged their vows and everything. So, the special feature of this wedding was the big feast. As always, it's the main feature. It turned out to be quite a social success. All the guests ate enthusiastically and asked for more and raved about these sensational tastes. Can you imagine this? You're getting a feast, a big feast cooked all by Prabhupada. He cooked all the preparation by himself. He only had, what's her name, Jamuna, who was a first visit to the temple. He taught her how to make the kachoris, made potato kachoris.
So Keith wasn't there. Keith wasn't there.
He was in hospital.
Oh. He used to help.
But so he missed the initiation, the first one. But he wasn't there for the second one. So, Prabhupada's followers, who were accustomed to the simple daily fare of rice, dal and sabji and chapatis, they found the feast to be quite intoxicating, and they ate as much as they could get. Many of Mukunda's friends were all macrobiotic followers, and at first they fastidiously avoided taking any of the sweets. But gradually, the enthusiasm of the others wore them down. It wore down their resistance, and they also became captivated by the Swami's expert cooking. How could you say no? Janaki said, "My God, he's a good cook." After tasting Prabhupada's cooking. Bruce, who became Brahmananda, he had missed the first initiation, but he was there seeing the fire sacrifice for the wedding, and he was eating the Swami's kachoris for the first time. He resolved on that spot to dedicate himself to Krishna consciousness. That's what a good kachori can do to you. You know? He resolved on the spot to dedicate himself to Krishna consciousness, and he became one of the Swamiji's disciples as soon as possible. Almost all of the visitors personally approached Swamiji to thank him and congratulate him. He was very happy, and he said this was all Krishna's blessings, Krishna's grace. After the ceremony, Mukunda and his wife Janaki entertained many of the devotees and guests in their apartment. The evening had put everyone in a good mood, in high spirits. And Hayagriva was there reciting poetry for everyone. That was the entertainment. Hayagriva reciting poetry. Then someone turned on the television to catch a scheduled interview with Allen Ginsberg, the poet. And much to everyone's happiness, Allen Ginsberg began this program on television by playing her harmonium and chanting Hare Krishna. Wow. He even said that there's a Swami on the Lower East Side who was teaching this mantra yoga, Krishna consciousness. He was new and unheard of, but now the devotees were seeing a famous celebrity on television performing kirtan for the first time. Everything was just falling into place. The whole evening seemed very auspicious. Back at the apartment, Prabhupada, along with a few of his helpers, cleaned up after the ceremony. He was satisfied. He was introducing some of the major elements of his Krishna consciousness mission. He had initiated some disciples, he had married 2 of them, and he had feasted the public with Krishna prasadam. He said, if I had the means, I could hold a major festival like this every day. He was enlightened to do it. The next chapter is chapter 20, entitled Stay High Forever. But remember, this is the 60s, the time of, drugs was quite popular with young people. There was a slogan they used to say, turn on, tune in, and drop out. And many of them did just that. They dropped out of college, got into drugs, that's turning on, and they listened to music. So there's an article from the East Village Other, which is a little newspaper. This came out in October 1966. An excerpt from the article is like this. While this was going on, they're talking about the wedding, an old man, 1 year past his allotted 70. This guy's trying to be sophisticated. 1 year past his allotted 70.
What's the name?
That means 71 years.
Oh, 3 score and 10.
A score is 20.
Yeah.
So it's 70 plus 1.
70. Oh, plus 21.
Yeah. He wandered into New York's East Village and set about to prove to the world that he knew where God could be found. This is what they're saying in the article. In only 3 months, the man, Swami A.C. Bhaktivedanta, succeeded in convincing the world's toughest audience, namely the Bohemians. It wasn't hippies yet, it was Bohemians.
Beatniks.
Beatniks. So there were Bohemians, acid heads, potheads, and a few hippies that he showed them that he knew the way to God. He said, turn off, instead of tuning in, stop doing drugs, turn off, sing out, means chant Hare Krishna, and fall in, not drop out. Papa was so...
It's not join in?
Yeah, practically. The new brand of holy man, with all due deference to Dr. Timothy Leary, he was the man that introduced LSD. Timothy Leary, he was a professor. This is what he did. So they said that with due deference to Dr. Leary, this Swami has come forth with a brand of consciousness expansion that's sweeter than acid, he said, and cheaper than pot. It's free. Sweeter than acid and cheaper than pot. And it's non-bustable by the fuzz. I mean, the police won't arrest you for chanting and dancing. They used to call the police the fuzz. And the man said, how is all this possible? The Swami said, through Krishna. So now we continue. Prabhupada's health was good that summer of 66, and fall, or so it seemed. He worked long and hard, except for 4 hours of rest at night. He was always active. He would speak intensely, on and on, never tiring, and his voice was strong. His smiles were strong and charming, and his singing voice was loud and melodious. During kirtan, he would thump rhythms on his bongo drum. Sometimes for an hour he would do this. Prabhupada would lead kirtans for an hour. He ate heartily of rice, dal, chapatis and sabjis, all cooked with ghee. His face was full and his belly was protruding. He had a prasadam belly. Sometimes, in a light mood, he would drum with his 2 fingers on his belly and say that the resonance affirmed his good health. The sound that it would make on his belly. He said that would affirm his good health. His golden color and the radiance, his golden color had the radiance of youth and well-being preserved by his 70 years of healthy, non-destructive habits. He had never taken drugs. When he smiled, virility and vitality came on so strong as to embarrass the faded, dissolute New Yorker. In many ways, he was not at all like an old man. And his new followers completely accepted his active youthfulness as a part of the wonder of the Swami. Just as they had come to accept the wonder of the chanting and the wonder of Krishna. Swamiji wasn't an ordinary man. He was spiritual. He could do anything. None of his followers dared advise him to slow down. Nor did it ever really occur to them that he needed such protection. They were just busy trying to keep up with him. He had more enthusiasm than everyone. During the 2 months at 26 2nd Avenue, he had achieved what had formerly been only a dream. He now had a temple, a duly registered society, ISKCON, full freedom to preach, and a band of initiated disciples. Prabhupada did all this in the beginning, right away. He registered the society. When one of his godbrothers had written to him, asking him how he would manage a temple in New York, Prabhupada said he would need some men from India, but he would find some Americans who could help him. That had been the last winter. He never got any help from India. Now Krishna had put him in a different situation, since he received no help from his godbrothers, no big donations from Indian businessman and no assistance from the Indian government. But he was finding success in a different way. He used to say later, those were the happy days. Those were the happy days. Everything was simple. Although he had struggled alone for 1 year, he said, but then Krishna sent me men and money. Yes, those were happy days for Prabhupada. But his happiness was not like the happiness of an old man's sunset years, as the man would fade into the dim comforts of retirement. Prabhupada's happiness was not retiring. In fact, he said he wanted to die on the battlefield, fighting. Prabhupada's, his was the happiness of youth, a time of blossoming, a new blossoming of new powers, a time when future hopes expand without limits. He was 71 years old, but in ambition, he was a courageous youth. He was like a young giant just beginning to grow. He was happy because his preaching was taking hold, just as Lord Chaitanya had been happy when he had traveled alone to South India, spreading the chanting of Hare Krishna. Prabhupada's happiness was that of a selfless servant of Krishna, to whom Krishna was sending candidates for devotional life. So he was happy to plant the seeds of devotion within their hearts and to train them up in chanting Hare Krishna, hearing about Krishna, and working to spread Krishna consciousness. This is what it's all about. Hearing and chanting about Krishna and helping to spread Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada continued to accelerate. After the first initiations and the first marriage, he was eager for the next step. He was pleased by what he had, but he wanted to do more. It was the greed of a Vaishnava. This is not a greed to have sense gratification, but to take more and more for Krishna. He used to say, go in like a needle and come out like a plow. Go in like a needle and come out like a plow. That is to say, from a small, seemingly insignificant beginning, he would expand his movement to tremendous proportions. At least, that was his desire. He was not content with his newfound success and security at 26 2nd Avenue. He was yearning to increase ISKCON as far as possible. This had always been his vision, and he had written it into the ISKCON charters. He said, to achieve real unity and peace in the world within the members and humanity at large. That's the statements of Krishna consciousness. One day, Swami gathered his small group together. He knew that once they tried it, they would love it. But it would only happen if he personally went with them. So Washington Square Park was his next aim. This park was only half a mile away, maybe a little more. Rabindra Swarup, one of the later disciples, he said, the Swami never made a secret of what he was doing.
It's not the same one.
Hmm?
It's not the same one as we know.
No, this is an earlier one.
Earlier.
Yeah. He said, Swami never made a secret of what he was doing. He used to say, I want everybody to know what we are doing. And then one day, D-Day came, and he said, we are now going to go and chant in Washington Square Park. All his followers were scared. You mean we have to go out in the public?
Big time.
Big time. That's why he called it D-Day. They were scared because they thought, you just don't go into a park and chant. It seemed like a weird thing to do. But Swamiji assured them, saying, you won't be afraid once you start chanting. Krishna will help you. And so we all trucked down to Washington Square Park, but we were very upset about it. They went reluctantly.
So it wasn't from
On Harinam.
It was not from King Square Park then. It was Washington. I thought it was from King Square Park.
I guess not. Tompkins Square Park is a bigger park.
It came later.
Yeah. Well, no, this one was where they first started the Harinam. But they probably switched to Tompkins because it's closer.
Oh,
Right now, Washington Square Park is where they have Rath Yatra.
okay.
Rath Yatra comes down Fifth Avenue and they take up the whole park with the exhibits and booths and stages and people. So, I guess that's why they were a little scared to go there. So we all trucked down to Washington Square Park, but we were very upset about it. We were upset, up until that time, we weren't exposing ourselves. You know? And Rabindra Swarup said, I, for one, I was very upset about it. And I know that several other people were. To be making a public figure of yourself. That's how he saw it. You know? Anyway, with Prabhupada leading them, they set out that fair Sunday morning, walking the city blocks all the way from 2nd Avenue to Washington Square, which was in the heart of Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village is where all the hippies used to hang out in New York. In San Francisco, they hung out in Golden Gate Park. But in New York, this is where, if you wanted to see hippies, if you wanted to find your friends, you go to Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village. And the way Prabhupada looked, just by walking, he created a sensation. You know, he's the only one in robes. All his followers, initiated the disciples, they didn't have clothes, they didn't have robes yet. They were still dressed in civilians. None of the boys had even shaved their heads yet. And they had no robes. But because of Swamiji, with his saffron robes, his white pointy-tip shoes, and his shaved head held high, people were astonished. It wasn't like when he would go out alone, because he was like the Pied Piper. He had a bunch of followers following behind him. And that, him walking like that brought nothing more than an occasional second glance. You know, people would pass and they'd realize, what was that? And they'd look again. But today, on this day, with a group of young men hurrying to keep up with him, he headed through the city streets, obviously about to do something that would cause a stir. He's going to stir it up. Tough guys and kids would yell out names, you know, the Prabhupada and the devotees. And others laughed and made sounds. Just a year ago in Butler, Pennsylvania, the Agarwals, that's an Indian family, had been sure that Prabhupada would not come to America for followers. Sally, the wife of the husband, she was American, but her husband was Indian. She said, he didn't want to make any waves, but now he's doing just that. He's going out into the streets. So Sally said, he didn't want to make waves, but now he was making waves, walking through New York City streets, heading for the first public chanting in America, followed by his first disciples. In the park, there were hundreds of people milling about. Stylish, decadent Greenwich villagers, hippies. There was an amalgamation of faces, nationalities, ages, and interests. As usual, someone was there playing his guitar by the fountain. Boys and girls were sitting together and kissing. Some of them were throwing frisbees. Some of them were playing drums or flutes or some other instruments. And some of them were walking their dogs, talking, watching everything, and wandering around. This was a typical day in the village in the 60s. Prabhupada went to a patch of lawn where, despite a small sign that said, keep off the grass, Prabhupada ignored that sign. Many people were lounging around on the grass anyway. He sat down, and one by one his followers sat beside him. He took out his brass kartals and he sang the Maha Mantra. And his disciples responded somewhat awkwardly at first, because they were kind of afraid. But then it became stronger. It wasn't as bad as they thought it would be. One boy, Jagannath, he said, it was a marvelous thing, a marvelous experience that the Swamiji brought upon me, because it opened me up a great deal and I overcame a certain shyness that I had. The first time to chant out in the middle of everything. A curious crowd gathered around to watch, although no one joined in. The crowd just watching. A police officer came up and said, who's in charge here? Uh-oh, they're going to get busted. Who's in charge here? The officer spoke very roughly. The boys looked towards Prabhupada, saying him, he's in charge. The officer then asked, "Don't you see the sign?" Prabhupada furrowed his eyebrows and turned his eyes towards the sign. He got up and walked to an uncomfortably warm pavement. He got off the grass. Even though there's lots of other people on the grass lying down, hippies, and the police comes to tell Prabhupada to move. And Prabhupada disobeyed and then sat on the concrete. His followers struggled after to sit around him. Prabhupada continued the chanting for half an hour, and the crowd stayed there listening to them. A guru in America had never gone onto the streets before singing the names of God. This was a first. After the kirtan, Prabhupada asked for a copy of his Srimad Bhagavatam, and he had Hayagriva read aloud from the preface. With clear articulation, Hayagriva read, quote, "Disparity in the human society is due to the basic principle of a godless civilization. There is God, the Almighty One, from whom everything emanates, by whom everything is maintained, and in whom everything is merged to rest." The crowd was still hearing Hayagriva read. Afterward, the Swami and his followers got up and walked back to the storefront, feeling elated and victorious. They had broken the American silence. Isn't that wonderful? Now, next section. Allen Ginsberg, he's the poet. They used to refer to him as the poet of the gutter. That's how the establishment referred to him, because he appealed to the young people, the hippies. So they call him the poet of the gutter. Allen Ginsberg lived nearby on East 10th Street. One day, he received a peculiar invitation in his mail. It said, "Practice the transcendental sound vibration. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. This chanting will cleanse the dust from the mirror of the mind." And below it said, "International Society for Krishna Consciousness, meetings at 7 a.m. daily. Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 7 p.m. You are cordially invited to come and bring your friends." Prabhupada, he composed this. This was the first mantra card devotees would pass out in the streets to invite people to come. Years later, when I was in Laguna Beach, I found this and I reprinted it, and we would also pass it out because I thought it was perfect. Prabhupada composed it. Prabhupada, or the Swamiji, had asked the boys to go and distribute this card, pamphlet, all around the neighborhood. One evening, soon after he had received the invitation, Allen Ginsberg and his roommate, Peter Orlovsky, arrived at the storefront in a Volkswagen minibus Alan had been captivated by the Hare Krishna mantra several years before. Remember, we read that he was getting an interview on television, and he began his interview by first chanting Hare Krishna and playing the harmonium. And the nude initiates were like, wow, they couldn't believe it on television. So now he comes to visit the temple for the first time. Allen Ginsberg had encountered the Hare Krishna mantra at Kumbh Mela, which is a festival in Allahabad, India. So he had been to India, Allen Ginsberg. And since that time, he had been chanting it often ever since. The devotees were impressed to see this world-famous author of the Howl magazine and a leading figure in the Beat generation enter into their humble storefront. He was well known. His advocation of free sex, marijuana, and LSD, his claims of drug-induced visions of spirituality in everyday sights, and his political ideas, his exploration of insanity, revolt, and nakedness, and his attempts to create a harmony of like-minded souls. All of these were influential on the minds of American young people, these ideas, especially those living on the Lower East Side. Although by middle-class standards, he was just a scandalous and disheveled person, but he was in his own right a figure of worldly repute, more so than anyone who had ever come to the storefront. He was a celebrity. Allen Ginsberg recalls, quote, Bhaktivedanta seemed to have no friends in America. He was alone, totally alone. And he had gone somewhat like a lone hippie to the nearest refuge, the place where it was cheap enough to rent. Talking about the Lower East Side. This is his perception of Prabhupada. There were quite a few people sitting cross-legged on the floor, I remember. I think most of them were from the Lower East Side hippies who had just wandered in off the streets with beards and a curiosity of inquisitiveness and a respect for a spiritual presentation of some kind. Some of them were sitting with glazed eyes, means they were stoned, intoxicated. But most of them were just little gentle folk, bearded, hip, and curious. They were refugees from the middle class in the Lower East Side, looking exactly like the street sadhus of India. It was very similar, that place in America, in American underground history. And I liked it immediately. The idea that Swami Bhaktivedanta had chosen the Lower East Side of New York for his practice. He had gone to the lowest depths of America, the lower depths of America. He had gone to a spot more like the streets of Calcutta in India. They used to say, there used to be a saying that Calcutta was considered to be the anus of India. Because there's so many poor people sleeping in the streets and, you know. So the Lower East Side was like America's version of it. And that's where Prabhupada went. Alan and Peter had come to the center for the kirtan, but Prabhupada hadn't come down yet. So they presented a new harmonium to the devotees and they said, this is for kirtan. They didn't even have a harmonium in the temple yet. They didn't have a mridanga. And I think Prabhupada was the only one with kartals. Alan said as he gave the devotees the harmonium, he said, this is just a little donation. He stood at the entrance of the storefront and began talking with Hayagriva, telling him how he, Alan, had been chanting Hare Krishna all around the world, at peace marches, poetry readings, a procession in Prague. That's in Russia, somewhere? Prague? Czech. He met a procession in Prague, a writers' union in Moscow, and secular kirtan. So that's why he was well known. He was going all around the world doing this thing, and he would always chant. He said, but Hare Krishna, nonetheless, I would chant. Then Prabhupada entered, and Alan and his friend, his roommate Peter, sat with the congregation and joined in the kirtan that Prabhupada led, while Alan played the harmonium. Alan said, he remembers, I was astounded that he had come here with the chanting. It seemed like a reinforcement from India. I had been running around the world singing Hare Krishna, but I never understood exactly what it meant. He heard it in the Kumbh Mela. But I was surprised to see that he had a different melody. Because I thought the melody that I knew, I thought that was the only melody. Little did he know. I thought that was the universal melody. I had gotten so used to it, to my melody, that actually the biggest difference I had with him was over the tune. That was the only thing he didn't quite accept. Because I had solidified my tune in my mind for years. And to hear another tune actually blew my mind. After the lecture, Alan came forward to meet Prabhupada, who was still sitting on his dais. Alan offered his respects with folded palms. He touched Prabhupada's feet. Prabhupada reciprocated by nodding his head and folding his palms. They talked together briefly, and then Prabhupada returned to his apartment. Alan mentioned to Hayagriva that he would come by again and talk more with the Swami. So Hayagriva invited him to come the next day and stay for lunch. Then before leaving, Allen Ginsberg told Hayagriva, don't you think the Swamiji is a little too esoteric for New York? Look who's talking. Allen Ginsberg, Hayagriva replied, maybe. It was definitely different. So, we have stopped here. A good place to stop. 9 o'clock. And we shall continue next Sunday. Same time, same channel. Haribo. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Sometimes I think, Prabhupada was just watching it all unfold. He was as much amazed about it happening
Sure.
than anyone else.